Hello, I hope you're all well today. We are going to be continuing our reading of the Geneva Convention. This is the third Geneva Convention relative to the treatment of prisoners of war, 12th of August, 1949. General Provisions. Article 1. The high contracting parties undertake to respect and ensure the respect for the present convention in all circumstances. Article 2. In addition to the provisions which shall be implemented in peacetime, the present convention shall apply to all cases of declared war or any other armed conflict which may arise between two or more of the high contracting parties, even if the state of war is not recognized by one of them. The Convention shall also apply to all cases of partial or total occupation of the territory of a high contracting party, even if the said occupation meets with no armed resistance. Although one of the powers in conflict may not be a party to the present conventions, the powers who are parties thereto shall remain bound by it in their mutual relations. They shall furthermore be bound by the convention in relation to the said power if the latter accepts and applies the provisions thereof. In the case of armed conflict, not of an international character, occurring in the territory of one of the high contracting parties, each party to the conflict shall be bound to apply, as minimum, the following provisions. Persons taking no active part in the hostilities, including members of the armed forces who have laid down their arms, those placed hors de combat by sickness, wounds, detention, or any other cause, shall in all circumstances be treated humanely, without any adverse distinction founded on race, color, religion, or faith, sex, birth, or wealth, or any other similar criteria. To this end, the following acts are and shall remain prohibited at any time in any place whatsoever with respect to the above mentioned persons: violence to the life and person, in particular murder of all kinds, mutilation, cruel treatment, and torture; taking of hostages; outrages upon personal dignity, in particular humiliating and degrading treatment. D. The passing of sentences and the carrying out of executions without previous judgment pronounced by a regularly constituted court, affording all the judicial guarantees which are recognized as indispensable by civilized peoples. The wounded and the sick shall be collected and cared for. An impartial humanitarian body such as the International Committee of the Red Cross may offer its services to the parties to the conflict. The parties to the conflict should further endeavor to bring into force by means of special agreements all or part of the other provisions of the present convention. The application of the preceding provisions shall not affect the legal status of the parties to the conflict. 4. Prisoners of war, in the sense of the present conventions, are persons belonging to one of the following categories who have fallen into the power of the enemy: members of the armed forces of a party to the conflict, as well as members of militias or volunteer corps forming part of such armed forces; members of other militias and members of other volunteer corps, including those organized resistance movements belonging to a party to the conflict and operating outside their own territory, and operating in or outside their own territory, even if this territory is occupied. provided that such militias or volunteer corps, including such organized resistance movements, fulfill the following conditions. A. That of being commanded by a person responsible for his subordinates. B. That of having a fixed, distinctive sign recognizable at a distance. C. That of carrying arms openly. D. That of conducting their operations in accordance with the laws and customs of war. 3. Members of regular armed forces who profess allegiance to a government or an authority not recognized by the detaining power. Persons who occupy the armed forces without actually being members thereof, such as civilian members of military aircraft crews, war correspondents, supply contractors, members of the labor units of services responsible for the welfare of the armed forces, provided that they have received authorization from the armed forces which they accompany, who shall provide them for that purpose with identity card similar to the annexed model. 5. Members of crews, including master pilots and apprentices of merchant marine and crews of civil aircraft of the parties to the conflict, who do not benefit by more favorable treatment under any other provisions of international law. Inhabitants of non-occupied territory who, upon the approach of invading forces without having time to form themselves into regular armed units, provide they carry arms openly and respect the laws and customs of war. The following shall likewise be treated as prisoners of war under the present convention: persons belonging or having belonged to the armed forces of the occupied country, if the occupying power considers it necessary by reason of such alliance to intern them, even though it has originally liberated them while hostilities were ongoing outside the territory it occupies, in particular where such persons have made an unsuccessful attempt to rejoin armed forces to which they belong and which are engaged in combat, or where they fail to comply with the summons made to them with a view to internment. The persons belonging to one of the categories enumerated in the present articles who have been received by neutral or non-belligerent powers on their territory, and whom these powers are required to intern under international law without prejudice to any more favorable treatment which these powers may choose to give, with the exception of Articles 8, 10, 15, 30, 5th paragraph, 58, 67, 92, 126, and where diplomatic relations exist between the parties to the conflict and neutral or non-belligerent power concerned. Those articles concerning the protecting power, where such diplomatic relations exist, the parties to a conflict whom these persons depend shall be allowed to perform towards them the functions of a protecting power as provided in the present convention without prejudice to the functions which these parties normally exercise in the conformity with diplomatic and consular usage and treaties. C. This article shall in no way affect the status of medical personnel and chaplains as provided for in Article 33 of the present convention. Article 5. The present convention shall apply to the persons referred to in Article 4 from the time they fall into the power of the enemy until their final release and repatriation. Should any doubt arise as to whether persons having committed a belligerent act or having fallen into the hands of the enemy belong to any of the categories enumerated in Article 4, such persons shall enjoy the protections of the present convention until such time as their status has been determined by a competent tribunal. In addition to the agreements expressly provided for in Articles 10, 23, 28, 33, 60, 65, 66, 67, 72, 73, 75, 109, 110, 118, 119, 122, and 132, the high contracting parties may conclude other special arrangements for all matters concerning which they deem it suitable to make separate provisions. No special agreement shall adversely affect the situations of prisoners of war as defined by the present convention, nor restrict the rights which it confers upon them. Prisoners of war shall continue to have the benefit of such agreements as long as the convention is applicable to them, except where express provisions to the contrary are contained in the aforesaid or subsequent agreements, where more favorable measures have been taken with regard to them by one or other of the parties to the conflict. Article 7. Prisoners of war may in no circumstances renounce in part or entirety of the rights secured to them by the present convention and the special agreements referred to in the foregoing article, if such there be. Article 8. The present convention shall be applied with the cooperation and under the scrutiny of protecting powers, whose duty it is to safeguard the interests of the parties to the conflict. For this purpose, the protecting powers may appoint, apart from their diplomatic or consular staff, delegates from amongst their own nationals or the nationals of a neutral power. The said delegates shall be subject to the approval of the power with which they are to carry out their duties. The parties to the conflict shall facilitate to the greatest extent possible the task of representatives or delegates of the protecting power. The representatives or delegates of the protecting power shall not in any case exceed their mission under the present convention. They shall in particular take account of the imperative necessities of the security of the state wherein they carry out their duties. Article 9. Provisions of the present convention constitute no obstacle to the humanitarian activities which the International Committee of the Red Cross or any other impartial humanitarian organization may, subject to the consent of the parties to the conflict concerned, undertake for the protection of prisoners of war and their relief. Article 10. High contracting power. Article 10. The high contracting parties may at any time agree to entrust to an organization which offers all guarantees of impartiality and efficacy of the duties incumbent on the protecting powers by virtue of the present convention. When prisoners of war do not benefit or cease to benefit, no matter what reason, the activities of a protecting power or of an organization provided for in the first paragraph above, the detaining power shall request a neutral state or such organization to undertake the functions performed under the present convention by a protecting power designated by the parties to a conflict. If protection cannot be arranged accordingly, the detaining power shall request or shall accept, subject to the provisions of the article, the offer of the services of a humanitarian organization such as the International Committee of the Red Cross to assume the humanitarian functions performed by protecting powers under the present convention. Any neutral power or any organization invited by the power concerned or offering itself for these purposes shall be required to act with a sense of responsibility towards the party to the conflict on which persons protected by the present convention depend, and shall be required to furnish sufficient assurances that it is in a position to undertake the appropriate functions and to discharge them impartially. No degradation from the preceding provision shall be made by special agreements between powers, one of which is restricted, even temporarily, in its freedom to negotiate with the other power or its allies by reason of military events, more particularly where the whole or substantial part of the territory of the said power is occupied. Whenever the present convention mention is made of protecting power, such mention applies to the substitute organization in the sense of the present article. Article 11. In cases where they deem it advisable in the interests of protected persons, particularly in the cases of disagreement between the parties to the conflict as to the application or interpretation of the provisions of the present convention, the protecting powers shall lend their good offices with a view to settling the disagreement. For this purpose, each of the protecting powers may either, at the invitation of one party or its own initiative, propose to the parties to the conflict a meeting of their representatives, and in particular of the authorities responsible for the prisoners of war, possibly on neutral territory suitably chosen. The parties to the conflict shall be bound to give effect to the proposals made to them for this purpose. The protecting powers may, if necessary, propose for approval by the parties to the conflict a person belonging to a neutral power or delegated by the International Committee of the Red Cross, who shall be invited to take part in such a meeting. General protection of prisoners of war. Article 12. Prisoners of war are in the hands of the enemy power, but not of the individuals or military units who have captured them. Irrespective of the individual responsibilities that may exist, the detaining power is responsible for the treatment given to them. Prisoners of war may only be transferred by the detaining power to a power which is a party to the convention, and after the detaining power has satisfied itself of the willingness and ability of such transferee power to apply the convention. When prisoners of war are transferred under such circumstances, responsibility for the application of the convention rests on the power accepting them while they are in its custody. Nevertheless, if that power fails to carry out the provisions of the convention in any important respect, the power by whom the prisoners of war were transferred shall, upon being notified by the protecting power, take effective measures to correct the situation, or shall request the return of the prisoners of war. Such requests must be complied with. Article 13. Prisoners of war must at all times be humanely treated. Any unlawful act or omission by the detaining power causing death or seriously endangering the health of a prisoner of war in its custody is prohibited, and will be regarded as a serious breach of the present convention. In particular, no prisoner of war may be subject to physical mutilation or medical or scientific experiments of any kind, which are not justified by the medical, dental, or hospital treatment of the prisoner concerned and carried out in his interests. Likewise, prisoners of war must at all times be protected, particularly against acts of violence or intimidation, against insults and public curiosity. Measures of reprisals against prisoners of war are prohibited. Article 14. Prisoners of war are entitled in all circumstances to respect for their persons and their honor. Women shall be treated with all regard due to their sex, and shall in all cases benefit by treatment as favorable as that granted to men. Please keep your fucking hands off. Prisoners of war shall retain the full capacity which they enjoyed at the time of their capture. The detaining power may not restrict the exercise, either within or without its territory, of the rights of such capacity confers, except in so far as the captivity requires. Article 15. The power detaining prisoners of war shall be bound to provide free of charge for their maintenance and for the medical attention required by their state of health. Article 16. Taking into consideration the provisions of the present convention relating to rank, sex, and subject to any privileged treatment which may be accorded to them by reason of their state of health, age, or professional qualifications, all prisoners of war shall be treated alike by the detaining power without any adverse distinction based on race, nationality, religious belief, or political opinion, or any other distinction founded on similar criteria. And we will pick this up in a little bit.